All right, we're back at C3, the Kinggath podcast, resurrected once more. Once in a while, I like to bring it back, talk to folks, get back into the demonic spirit. Today I have with me Mr. Sirick, the writer of Sim Settlements 2. He and I have been working together for 8 years, something like that, something crazy like that. And in the honor of our 5th anniversary of SS2, and much longer than that since we started it, we thought we would have a little deep dive and go way back to the beginning of Sim Settlements 2 dev and talk about how we got to the final release of Chapter 3 and that completed story. Kind of the trials and tribulations of doing things as we did, what it was like to break things up into chapters and get them out in the world, and then continuing to kind of polish up and finish things up to this day. So welcome, Sirick.
Hello. It's been a while. I think I could be wrong. Was I the first guest on the very first podcast you did, like years ago now?
I think so. Yeah, I think you were the first guest on the kinggath podcast when I tried to do that and overstuffed my schedule with things and had to eventually pull the plug on that.
Well, it's great to be back.
It's good to be back. Yeah, it's I actually love doing this, and I wish I had more time to do it. So it's fun to be able to do this for C3, and I think we have garnered ourselves a reputation for being storytellers more than systems modders anymore. I think between the direction SS2 went over SS1, and then pretty much everything we've released since, whether it be the charity mods or the stuff we've been doing in the VC program, it's all very story driven. That is not the case when you came on board. In fact, I don't think you even came on board to be a writer originally.
No, I could be wrong. 'Cause it's so long ago, I can barely remember. But I think I came on to do voices for Conqueror. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think I did. It was one of the Raider characters or something.
It was either Conqueror or could have been. So we went crazy with. Like when Sim Settlements went as popular as it did initially, I just started recruiting everybody. I was like, let's get voice actors and writers and artists and just like, everybody come on, let's do this. And so I know we did a big push for just voice actors in general. Like we didn't even know what we were doing yet, but we were just like, let's bring everybody in and do stuff. So you might have been pulled into that wave too, of just like, let's just do a bunch of cool settlers and stuff. So I don't remember. I didn't even recruit you. I think you probably talked to... God, I don't even remember who it would have been at this point, because I had several directors at one point and an audio engineer. So there were a lot of people that you could have talked to at the beginning. But I think we've told the story before. So I'll kind of sum up this part of how you got involved quickly. Of you started out as a voice actor and you had just DM'd me one day and said something like, hey, I'm also an amateur writer if you ever need assistance in that realm. And then I had you, I think, do some punch up on something for Conqueror. And we liked it. And then one of the people who was assigned to work on a story mode for Sim Settlements, for the original Sim Settlements, bowed out. And the other person needed a partner. And that ended up being you. And then you kind of drifted into the lead role there. And I won't say the rest is history because we got a lot to talk about on the writing front. But then you just one day you just had it all. It was just yours. And yeah, that was a great move because it ended up being that you got a knack for it, even though that wasn't your primary goal.
Apparently, I never studied for it. I didn't go to school for it. In fact,
don't tell people that.
Really,
let them believe.
I mean, I went to university. I studied at all the best places. No, my background was primarily in acting, in drama. I prefer to be on stage and be the person dancing around and singing and so on. I actually did do really poorly in English.
That's why we give you an editor. Right?
So yeah, that was a surprise to me that like I seem to be okay at writing to the point that I can write SS2, and now we can work on kinggath creation stuff. I didn't expect to be doing this as a living, but people like it, so okay, I'll keep doing it. I don't mind.
I think one of the reasons that you're good at writing and that we get along really well, like you and I riff a lot about ideas for stuff. And I think we actually have the same, very similar back catalog of games we grew up on, right? A lot of our old school RPGs, a lot of narrative driven games. And like I know you have a crushing obsession with old school Baldur's Gate, not BG3. Let's not talk about it. Though we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But the Baldur's Gate, you are a 1 and 2, right? Or are you a purist? Are you only 1?
1 and 2. Played it when I was young. Probably too young to have played it. I think I was 8 when the first one came out. But something about it just captured me, and I loved that game. Played it backwards and forwards. And then the second one came out a year or two later. It actually scared me. It was too different because they went way more into the storytelling in number two, and I didn't get past the first dungeon for about a year. I just put it aside; it was too scary. Then I came back to it, replayed it, and now it's my favorite. So I
Oh
love
wow.
both of them, but I find it interesting that at some point it was too much for my child mind to just be like, whoa, this is crazy. It's higher resolution and the characters are talking more. Oh, the words. And I was not a strong reader. I know I'm making a great case for me being a writer, but
That
but like
was
Baldur's Gate's the game that actually got me reading because there was so much text on the screen. I wanted to know what was happening. So
yeah.
uh, that's
That's what
probably part of why I love it so much.
that my 7-year-old got into reading because he wanted to beat me at Pokemon, the card game. So gaming drive you to read. It's a
It really
good
does.
medium for that.
Well, it did. I'm not sure it'd be the same these days.
Fair.
Hmm.
Well, it worked out well. So anyway, you have a lot of RPGs in your back catalog of games of like your favorite games, and I think it probably helped with your writing now, which is obviously we're doing in Bethesda games, we're doing a lot of stuff, so everything is very dialogue heavy and driven by that. So going with SS2, so originally you were brought on to do you kind of took over for a main quest. So the idea when we started Sim Settlements, what became Sim Settlements 2 is Sim Settlements 1 came out, and I always liked games that have a narrative to teach you things, so that it feels like a disguised tutorial. It feels like a tutorial with a purpose. It's kind of giving you the tips so you understand what you're doing, but also the reason for why you're doing it, so that you have, even if it's just imaginary characters on screen, having somebody care that you're doing a thing feels a lot better than just doing it mindlessly. And so I wanted that for Sim Settlements. So the task given to the pair of writers before you was just take what we already had in Sim Settlements, which was, the different plot types. And then like I had a few just general ideas of like, all right, well, we might as well make use of the museum, and you can go grab Preston on your way because that's your first settlers. And then why don't we tour around the Commonwealth and hit a handful of things and just kind of give everything a feel like it's all tied together. And you inherited a story that had, pretty sprawling ideas, but it was kind of stuck when you got it. And I think a lot of those ideas got scrapped, but a few things made it along for the ride. Like the Ron was one of the things that survived from the very first draft. So what was it like coming in on that and being handed this behemoth of a project with not a ton of great direction at the time?
Confusing in retrospect. This is something I've thought about a lot of what could have been if I was where I am now in terms of my writing ability, and I went back to SS2 as we started. Because as you say, there was a lot there to inherit. Like I got Jake. Well, he wasn't called Jake, but Jake as a concept existed. Like he had his southern accents. That was part of the data character sheet that was came from somewhere. I think he was called James after the King James Bible.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So he was going to be called James at some point, but he got changed to Jake simply for the reason of there's a voice line for the player saying Jake. So that's why he's called that. So it was things like that. We had characters, we had some concepts like I'm going to assume people listening have a knowledge of SS2, so I'll be throwing out terms. So if none of this makes sense, I'm very sorry, and just go play SS2. But there's something that becomes relevant called the engram tapes. Which was, I think that was part of the original concept. They
I
were
think
called
so
the
too.
memory tapes. Yeah.
I
And I think
think we kept
originally,
calling them the brain tapes too. I remember seeing that in
yeah,
early, like the names of the model files that we had made.
mm,
Yeah.
I think that was where the ASAM technology came from originally. It, I'm not sure, like Magnuson didn't exist yet as a concept. He's fully my creation, I'll have you know. Uh, But I decided, well, there needs to be like, where did this knowledge come from? It needs to be a scientist. So when I inherited it, it's like, okay, Magnuson created these memory tapes, and it's his memories, and I guess he invented ASAMs. Um, and it was meant to be that Jake was trying to find the memory tapes because his father had done this before by coming to the Commonwealth and had brought ASAM technology back to where he existed in Sanford, but that didn't have a name yet. And his father had come back to the Commonwealth and disappeared, so Jake had come to find him, and he was sort of trying to follow the footsteps of the memory tapes or something, and that's where the play came in. So it's like there's vague familiarity to what we have, but it was also very different. Like if we'd continued with that story, it wouldn't be the SS2 we know. And I'm kind of like glad that we had a lot of teething problems in the beginning. I think in terms of trying to get a story that felt good and worked, and also tied in with the scope we were aiming for at the time, which definitely didn't remain where it was.
Yeah, that's true. Because so Sim Settlements, what became Sim Settlements 2, I think we decided it was going to be Sim Settlements 2 after the first year of development on what it was. So just a little background for folks who don't know. So Sim Settlements, the original, came out, and it was just a systems mod. I built it almost entirely by myself, and then a few people threw me some extra little bits. I'd like somebody threw me some sound effects, and somebody threw me some explosions, but otherwise it was just me toiling away at it. And then once I had the opportunity to expand it, then brought on a lot of people, and then myself and a couple of other people started working on the first expansion, which was Industrial Revolution, which added in all the mechanical buildings and stuff and really expanded on the industrial plot type. Then sometime while that was being developed, then we pivoted over to working on the story stuff. So then it was like all these characters were going to start showing up, and then eventually we would put out a patch with this main quest. And then so during all this, like as more stuff is happening and I'm building out this stuff, and I kind of left you guys do what you wanted to on the writing. It was just kind of like, as long as it covers the mechanics, I'm happy to do whatever. And so but then I kept adding more mechanics. So then it was like, okay, now we're working on, figured out how to do the city plan idea. So it's like, now we have this system to build the whole settlements for you. So go ahead and work that into the story too, right? So then all of a sudden you were getting thrown more and more things to build into the story and make sure they could be explained. And I think that kind of helped us steer things right to where it was like, all right, well, we're going to need this. Like now we need this character archetype, or we need this moment to happen in order to explain that in a way that feels good. And then so that kind of started steering a lot of, like, I remember very particular conversations of like characters like Old Paul and Mansfield, like existed because we had a role to fill when we were plotting out the whole story in a way. And like, we need to teach this mechanic way down the line, but we don't want to just like have a character pop up out of nowhere. So we need to introduce them earlier. And there was a lot of that went on, which is, I think, part of the benefit of us working on the story for so long is that we were able to like really plan far ahead for that kind of stuff.
It is interesting to look back because each chapter has a sort of different flavor to it. Chapter 1 was us trying to figure all that stuff out. And then chapter 2, we kind of already knew what we were doing, or at least what we hoped to do. So it was a very sort of, can't think of the right word, sort of a chapter designed to sort of carry 1 and 2 and stitch them together, chapter 2, because like we knew where we wanted things to go. But even in chapter 2, I think we were sort of adding new mechanics and new stuff in that we didn't really expect, like I could be wrong, but I think like the war mechanic that came in chapter 3 wasn't initially planned, but it just came and was like, okay, that makes sense. We're going to go that way.
The chapter thing came about because after Conqueror came out, I then took, I can't remember if it was before. I think before Conqueror, I took a break and did Workshop Framework because there were so many problems with the pace, like the speed of the workshop scripts and how limited they were. It just really tied our hands for what we could do. And doing Workshop Framework, and I worked really closely with some other programmers who are good with Papyrus, and realized that the code for Sim Settlements was just garbage, just straight garbage. And I was like, I got to start over. I got to start this code over. And so what better way than booting up with a fresh story, right? And being able to like clean up all the code and then have the new user experience be totally different. So once we knew we were on a sequel, I don't remember when do you remember when we shifted over to chapters exactly? Because we just realized the scope was so massive on the thing. Like I know that often drives our decisions of like we're trying to get stuff out periodically.
We were going to end what would have been chapter 2. So the attack at the Gunners Plaza. We had a kind of different version of that where it wasn't there. It was going to happen, I think, at the castle. And that was going to be the big final fight of all of SS2. And it was...
That's right. Yeah. I remember that design because we had a whole design. In fact, we used that design in chapter 3, the design of the castle. So for those of you guys who have used the city plans that Lupe will build for you during chapter 3, the one for, I think we did all 3 of them were for this, right? Originally it was like we even back then wanted before we had chapter 3 in mind, we wanted to give the player the choice of a settlement to like do their final showdown. Or was it? Yeah, I think that's how it was. Yeah. So those plans were actually made, probably 5 years before like before Chapter 3 came out. It was a long time. And
Well, none of them had plot types on them. Those had to be added in like years later. We had to go back and have stuff stripped out and then have a plot put down instead because it was meant to be a fully built location for some reason. I don't know why that was the case back then, but like it
right.
had to be that way. I don't know why.
I think, yeah, it was probably
That's
just limitations in the code at the time that we since overcame. Probably something to do with like worried about power grid corruption in the game or something like that. But yeah, that was where, so those plans were very old. Yeah, we had to retrofit them to get plots into them. And, but yeah, those were going to be, we had this whole sequence of, basically it was like an alternate path to deal with the main factions, right? Like we were giving you another story path through like to deal with the Institute.
I'm trying to remember. Yeah, for some reason, I think it was the Institute, the Brotherhood, and the Minutemen? Question mark. Could fight the player for the memory tapes because they wanted them for a reason that I cannot remember
Yeah.
at all. And so you'd have a big epic fight with like either one of them or possibly all of them at the same time. I think each faction had something new to bring to the fight. So I think like the Institute had the Mega Synth, which was going to come out of the ocean, which is why we wanted it at the castle.
Yeah.
The Brother had like a smaller Pridwin called the
I,
Calburn.
yeah. I think we had a model made of it too or
I
something. I
think so.
remember
Yeah,
there's like a 3D model of like another airship that's smaller than the Pridwin. We
which we
had a
didn't
lot of
use.
we have a lot of stuff that because that was an interesting part of development because I was always just go on things, right? Just managing, putting together teams for stuff or build workshop framework or whatever. Like I always had projects going on. I just kind of let you do what you wanted on the main quest stuff, and that included you just like you were working with whoever was on the team for artists and giving them tasks. Because I remember when I finally like refocused and was like, all right guys, we're doing SS2 and that's gonna be my focus. And I was like, there's all these models and stuff already done and ready to go. What is all this? We were it was a very strange development cycle the way how that went down. But I think we've used most of the things that we even created for the older chapters. Like there's a couple of things that didn't make it in, like the ghoul alien got cut. I know we have a berserker, like what do you call it, super mutant that got cut. But some of these maybe they'll make an appearance in some of the post launch content that we're still hoping to do. So maybe we shouldn't talk about them too much.
Definitely that super mutant. Well, we might be seeing him again. Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this chapter stuff and talk to you about this is I think there's a curse in the modding scene, and not just in Bethesda's modding scene, but it's in most games, is that people come out of the woodwork with ambitious ideas to do these big epic scoped projects, and they're running on just like pure adrenaline and motivation in the early days, like in the first year, but that eventually dries up, and then you have to have something else to carry you through. So it can be, just dedication, and you're a hard worker, and you just commit to doing a certain amount of hours per week, no matter what. We found another way though. I think we have, a mix of people who operate like that versus people who are just totally operate on inspiration, which is pretty much the typical for an artist is you got to be inspired to work. And I think our secret sauce that we came up with was we get inspired by having people want our stuff out, right? Like seeing an audience react and get excited. Like that's obviously in your nature, which is why you were probably drawn to theater, right? Like it feels really great to have an audience respond to something you're doing. And so we kind of figured out that like releasing stuff every 6 to 8 months kept us fueled, and we just kept going. And then it also opened up opportunities for bringing on more people who were excited. So I think the chapters was kind of born of that, in that it was like we looked at the scope and like how long we had to go on the story as a whole, and it was just like, this is going to take us 3 or 4 years to do. We didn't know it was going to actually take us 5 years, but it was just the scope of it was so big. Like started out with just teach the player how to use plots, and then ended up with like teach the player how to use plots, work up to a point where they're building their own faction, and then take that faction to war. It's a pretty big leap.
I would agree. I would like to go trim some stuff out. I think that's one of the downsides of sort of releasing things in the chapters. Like you don't get to see the full picture until you're done, and you can go back and change things, and we have. We tweak and clean things up, and be like, let's add a new thing here, or like I remember in chapter 2, we went back and had before chapter 2, we released a more simple version of the Marshall plot. because that didn't exist until chapter 2. I think I could be
Right.
wrong. So we do things like that, but for the most part, what's in chapter 1 that was there from the start. Like other than some minor tweaks and polish. Same with chapter 2 and same with chapter 3. But by the time you get to chapter 3, you look back at chapter 1 and you think things like, I really wish I'd introduced the main villain all the way back there in the beginning.
Right, right.
I did it with other characters, but I didn't know what I wanted to do yet. So we have a character who shows up in chapter 3, and she takes over as the main antagonist. That's Lamont. She now leads the Gunners. But you don't really hear anything about her, I think, until at least chapter 2. I think she's mentioned by name a few times, but she doesn't mean anything to the player. Like, she's a non-entity, but we could have figured out a way to at least have her appear somewhere in chapter 1, because we have Magnuson. He gets at least name dropped in chapter 1 quite a few times.
Yeah.
And then I think we also went back and put some like holotapes and a few more records when we did chapter 3, because we didn't have a voice actor for him until chapter 3. So we had holotapes written for him, but just no one to voice them. So we went back and placed those. But for the most part, Magnuson existed in chapter 1, and he was important, and we were going to pay that off.
Right.
Lamont existed as a concept, but not as a character. So it would have been great if we had released everything in one big chunk. Then we could have come back and sort of added Lamont in earlier.
Right.
But because we did it chapters, that's a downside of the chapter approach. But it's a minor weakness for what we get overall. Like, I'm glad we did it that way, and I do think that's the best way that we could have done it, and probably for other projects. Not all projects, but for most projects, at least where you've planned things out well enough, I think that can work. But if you were doing something where you were being very creative the whole time, I don't think our chapter thing would work very well, because if you release, say, 3 chapters, chances are by the time you get to whatever your chapter 3 is, you'll have all these cool new ideas, but realize, oh, I didn't mention any of these in chapter 1.
Right, yeah, I didn't prepare for any of them. Yeah, I know, that's what the trailer we ended up doing for chapter 3 almost felt like required viewing, just to like catch people up to what was going on in chapter 3, because we didn't get a chance to introduce that. There's also the other interesting problem with the Bethesda style of RPG and storytelling is because they don't use typical cutscenes that other games might use. You every time you want to show the player the villain, for example, like you have to come up with some sort of contrived reason why they can't just shoot them in the face, right? So it's like, bulletproof glass or holotapes, or we can't even do screens easily because there's not like a in-game camera system. So it becomes very difficult to also squeeze in meaningful opportunities to witness the villain. And I feel like we went through the same thing with Conqueror, and I think we're always going through it when we do stuff, whether it be in Skyrim or Starfield too. It's always the same problem of like, how do you set up an antagonist that's meaningful when the player's by the time the player gets to see them, they're going to want to kill them, because the player's used to having pretty unlimited agency in these games.
That's definitely it. I get why Bethesda went the route they did in terms of you can break out of a conversation whenever you want. It makes for really good dynamic gameplay. God, it's difficult to write that, because you have to take, as you say, so many things into account. You can't have the villain waltz into a scene and twirl his mustache and say ha ha ha, because the player can just bring out a gun, exit the conversation, and shoot him. And what do I do now? Do I just kill the player, let the villain run away? That's lame. So yeah, definitely challenges. Like, there are ways around it, but I kind of feel at this point Bethesda's used all those ways. So
right,
you either have to come up with something very inventive, or you just don't have the Bethesda system. But that's what we're working with, and that's what we need to make. So it's definitely a challenge. I think if we were making sort of our own thing, I'd go more classic, where you get locked into a conversation until we decide you're out, rather than when the player decides they want to leave, or when a super mutant runs in and decides to smash the NPC you're talking to, which is great. But again, very difficult to write something that feels natural when you then have to pick that conversation up and be like, okay, I killed that super mutant that just clubbed you halfway across the map, and you're immortal, so you're technically alive still. And we're just going to ignore all of that from happening, and we'll get back to talking about the oranges, because that's a very important topic apparently.
Yeah, it gets weird sometimes with that, but we found enough workarounds. I think some of them. My favorite one is in chapter 2, when we have the glass in the vault door, and then we switch to a cutscene. So it's like you still, you get the benefits of a cutscene. The player's close enough for us to technically do it, right? There's some of it is technical limitations of doing cutscenes around the players, just because the player has to be in the area in this game engine. So like, I really like that one that we pulled off, and it doesn't involve dialogue. And I think
that once. I wish we did that more.
Oh, we do. Yeah, we wish we did that more. It definitely took a while to rig up that. Not only to rig up the sequence to work, but also just like to manipulate the story so that it lined up, right? And they're like, oh, okay, in this space we just duplicate this cell and we make this minor adjustment to add this locked door here, and then it'll work out. And I think the same thing happened with the Lamont sequence, where we wanted to run into her, of like, you had to come up with this crazy trap idea and work with a level designer to be like, can we do this? So we have like a chamber here and a chamber there and bulletproof glass in between. Like, that whole scene with her was another one where it was just like, that one we didn't cutscene it, but very much required, like, creating this, manipulating this sequence of events so that it made sense, just so that we could pull that off. Because like, that's the one time you get to see the type of person she is, right? Like, having just holotapes or radio calls is definitely not nearly as much as seeing a person and witnessing some actions they do. Hey, you in the audience, I'm breaking the podcast. I'm pausing to talk to you directly. This is a charity event, if you didn't know that. C3 isn't just about supporting mods, it is about supporting great causes, and we are proud to support the Make-A-Wish Foundation. There's a link below in the description where you can make a donation. If you've got the means, it would mean the world to them if you guys could help them out. So please click that link, throw them a few bucks, and with all that said, let's get back to the podcast. But I don't want to skip past the chapter thing, because I feel like we've given it a bad rap so far, because I think there were definitely more benefits than negatives to it. So I think, one of the first benefit I mentioned was that it's good motivation. I think another benefit is we learned a lot along the way, right? Like, rather than all 3 chapters being at the skill level of us at chapter 1, right? They were like, there was breaks in between, and we brought more people on, and we got to get more people who are specialists in certain avenues. Whereas like chapter 1, like, you set up all the dialogue scenes in the CK yourself, and then like I did all the rig up of the objectives and stuff, and then we fortunately, met SAG, and then he took on that role for chapter 2 to do both of our work in that regard, so that we could focus on our respective specialties. And so like, I think that was one benefit, is that it let us get something out there that inspired a lot of people, who then some of those folks joined us. So we expanded the team with that. We again, we got to feel the love from the audience, which gave us inspiration. And I think also it helped us drive the story in a good way. Like, I think it was, I know it was before release, but there was a point, and we won't go into any of the details of the meetings that led to this, because they were quite tumultuous, but there was a period where we were doing real regular deep dive writers meetings with like 3 or 4 of us, trying to figure out the plot of things. And for a while, we didn't really have an antagonist. It was just kind of like, it was basically just a giant tutorial, until all of a sudden there was a conflict with the main factions. And then we shifted gears and started weaving in the conflict with the gunners pretty late in design. I'm glad we did. I think we had the seeds for it, because I think like Berman and Wise were in there from one of the early drafts, but it was just like interesting characters, right? Just to be like, oh, who are these scumbags who are talking to the Ron, right? And then I feel like that was in there before we got into the idea of like Gunners being a villain. Do you remember when we put the Gunners in as that was going to be our antagonist?
I think, and I could be wrong because it's been so long.
Yeah.
But I think initially the Gunners were not necessarily an antagonist, but they were sort of more active in the story, because Algernon actually comes from that. He was involved with the team trying to find the memory tapes or something, and you were meant to have a confrontation with him at the Gunners Plaza on top of it, and like there's a small shack room, and you were going to find Jake in there tied up. So that scene what you find of Algernon, that's kind of the reworked version of that. But then we decided, I think, to shift to a new sort of antagonist that we invented, so it wasn't one of the pre-existing ones.
Mm-hmm.
So we shifted that way for a while, and then we ended up shifting back to the Gunners. So there was this weird middle where we didn't have an antagonist that we were trying to figure out. So I think we logically just went, just go back with the Gunners, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we were trying to be really clever, but we turned out, no, we're not as clever as we think. We had it right the first time. Go back.
Yeah. Well, I think having it, we created a lot of characters, and I think when you create too much new stuff, you risk alienating your audience who likes the existing stuff. So the more we can tie into the base game, I think people tend to appreciate that. I know I do. I appreciate it when I play other mods that do it, or like when Bethesda themselves on those rare occasions, because they seem to avoid it, of like actually integrating DLC back into the base game world. It feels really good to make it feel like it's part of the whole. Like it's like, oh, it's been there all along. And like I think that feels better. But I think part of like again, going back to the chapter benefits, because we were releasing it and then we got to like we would iterate over it and fix bugs, and we would sit and we would hear all the feedback from people as we had chances to strengthen up the story. Like I think one thing for certain that happened was we found out how much people loved Jake, and like in chapter 1, I think maybe there's one flirt option, but I don't think like we were all in on that until we saw the player base reaction to it.
I don't think there was a flirt option in chapter 1. I think chapter 2 is the first time you
That's
get
the first
that.
time we
I think
added
it's
that in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's when you rescue him from Algernon and you untime from the chair. I think that's the first one, and that is because of player reaction. So that was a discussion that came up. Do we make him romanceable? And I think we all decided we'd see what players think. Like if they like Jake and they want a romance, like okay, if that's what they want, that's what we'll give them.
Yeah.
But I think we were also willing to be like, oh, they don't want to romance him. Like that's just weird. They don't like him that much.
Yeah.
That was actually some discussion that went on behind the scenes when we were in those early days of would people even like Jake? I think there was talk of like some people like, oh, he's not going to be a good character, and some of people saying, oh no, he's going to be a great character. So we were unsure like how he'd be, how people would take this guy trying to teach you how to build ASAMs. Is he going to be annoying? Like I thought Paul would be annoying. I actually designed him to be a bit annoying, but people seem to like him, and that's why that's why we let him die, and that's why we let the player be a complete jerk about it. Because some people might be like, "Oh, I'm glad he's dead. He was annoying."
Yeah, they're one, like once in a while I hear somebody say that of like, "Oh, I don't like that guy. He's so silly." But I think most people are on Team Old Paul, and Old Paul was one of those characters that came up when we were discussing the pivot to the Gunners of like, we need a moment where the player like actually hates the Gunners, right? Because the Gunners in the base game have no personality. They're just raiders in better gear. I think that's how most people refer to them. And I think that was the whole Old Paul character and Berman thing, like that was all designed to like get people fired up. It was like, we need you to go. We want the players to decide we're going to war with these bastards. And so poor Old Paul was invented just for that. And then we amped it up with cola too. Somebody put me in touch with Fried Turkey, and he and Grill are masters of getting crazy stuff done in Fallout 4. And he put my dog in the game. And then I remember coming to you and like, we got to get this in. We got to squeeze it. And this was like probably a month before SS1 shipped or something, maybe a month and a half. And I was like, we got to figure out how to do this. And then I think we grabbed Super Weevil, who wrote Conqueror, and was like, hey, can you just make a quick quest? It doesn't have to be great or anything. And then I think the three of us sat down and talked about like, oh, it would make Old Paul endearing if he's papa to a little puppy. So like even people who didn't like his weirdo old-timey sayings, how do you hate a man who nurses a puppy back to life, right? So like it was all like little emotional manipulation to be like, we need the player to hate the Gunners. And it worked because you can see the fury most people have for Berman. Like whenever I do my Let's Plays and I always leave him live, people are like, nope, Berman dies every time. It's like, all right, good. We did too good a job maybe of making people want to get revenge for Old Paul.
Which is a shame because Berman was never meant to be a villain. Like he was meant to be a jerk, but you were never meant to like really, really hate him. But it worked out. I'm not going to complain about it, but I do find that funny that I think probably more people hate him than Lamont or Wes. Like,
right?
Who are those guys? I don't even remember those guys. But Berman, oh,
yeah, exactly. Oh, he was the face of the Gunners for us for a while, right? Because he was the only real contact point you have. I mean, he just looks like an asshole, right? You look at his face and he's a bit punchable. So, and that was like in chapter 1, that's the only contact. This leads me to another point that I think was like accidentally brilliant in the chapter breakup is, I'm pretty sure you made this decision of leaving chapter 1 with Jake kidnapped.
Yes.
And because then because it took us, 15, 16 months to get chapter 2 out. Like, to a lot of players, it was like, Jake's been gone for over a year, even though in game it happens in like 2 days, right? It's like you immediately go track him down. And I think that worked out phenomenally. Like, it's like, man, people have been missing Jake. And remember how cool the trailer moment felt when we show Berman punching Jake. Like, it's like he's just been locked in some seedy basement. Like, and that was after over a year before we had got to put that together. What made you think to cut at that moment? Did you anticipate that would be the case of like, oh, people are going to miss it, or was that just like dumb luck? We lucked out into that.
I think, and I could be wrong, I think it was purely for the case of I didn't want him hanging around all that time, just for a year, just being Jake, and I didn't want players to get tired of him, I think was the goal.
That's true, because he would have been around saying like 10 random lines, right? Because he would have no more content. Yeah. So
I think it's okay, how can we make him go away for a while? Well, let's tie into the story. So he gets kidnapped. I think we did have... We knew where the quest was going at that point, so it wasn't as if we were just going to have him kidnapped and then figure it out.
Yeah.
Because I do think we did discuss, should we... I think it did come up, someone saying like, oh no, we can't leave it there. We'll have to go rescue him, bring him back, and then we end that as chapter 1. Because otherwise, that's going to feel bad that you're not allowing players to go rescue him.
Yeah.
So we might have gone that way, because I do think there's some merit to that argument. But yeah, I think I'll take credit for it. It was genius. But I think it was mostly accidental. I think it just worked best.
So I don't remember who came up with the idea, but it definitely paid off. And I don't think, and that moment, like, not just the moment of him getting kidnapped, like that was a cool moment, but it had like a meta thing going on because of the chapter releases, right? It had more weight to it, which was a cool like side benefit of the chapter thing.
Yeah, you think you definitely need those sort of bookends for each chapter. So this is the beginning, this is the end, and now you can go off and interact with all the other stuff. Because we have the same with kind of chapter 2, where it's like,
chapter two was a little different though. Chapter 2. So first of all, I remember, so the plot of the whole story was largely figured out as far as like the major arc before we released chapter 1. Like, we knew we were going to go do the HQ thing, because I remember I have a presentation I did to the team about HQ, and I put that together like a few weeks after, maybe a month after chapter 1 released. It was pretty soon afterward. Maybe not that soon, but it was close enough to where I was like, well, we clearly already had this dreamed up. Oh, and I know we had it dreamed up because I remember we had another writer for a while trying to write the HQ team. Remember that? We had all those different characters, and then at some point we decided, because that writer left, we're like, all right, well, you don't know any of these characters. We need new characters for this, and we need to introduce them in chapter 1. We can't have this be like, oh, now you're putting together a whole new cast of characters for chapter 2. So that's where like Mansfield came up because of that, right? We were like, who would run a facility? Because we knew we wanted to do the HQ thing. So then like Mansfield got written in. I think the Vault was already in there, but it was like, why don't we use the somebody at the Vault?
I think Mansfield existed, but he didn't exist in the role that he'd get.
Right, he was probably just like a mouth, just the random guy at the Vault who would talk to you or whatever.
But it just made sense. And it was like, well, we have him, and he's not going to be doing anything else, so he can come join HQ.
Yeah. So that was a lot of that was all planned out. I think the biggest stuff that didn't get planned until after chapter 2 was all of was how we were going to wrap it all up, how we were going to bring a new fight, how we were going to have, how Magnuson was involved. I don't think Magnuson, like, as the way he manifested was planned from the get-go, because I remember when you told me that, I was like, that's awesome, that's so Fallout. But before that, I think there was a big question mark on how we were going to wrap it all up. So I feel like we had chapters 1 and 2 pretty well planned before chapter 1 came out. And then chapter 3, a lot of that planning and writing happened throughout both chapter 2 and chapter 3, because I remember all of the faction remnant stuff you had written way early, like that stuff because we just patched that 6 months ago, and it had been written for ages. Like, we had to go rework some of it because it just didn't quite plug in quite as nicely as we had hoped, because it had been written so long before that.
I think some of that could have been from the original ending we had, where it was that fight at the castle.
Yeah, where it was like, so we always had this, one of the goals always, because when I started with Fallout 4. Like I love the game to death, but I remember just always feeling like the settlements didn't matter to anybody. You know, it seemed like they would matter, and like Preston kept sending me to get more and more of them, and there was the whole the castle thing with the, you know, setting up the artillery everywhere, and you could do it as a backup plan to deal with the Institute, but I didn't find that path. So to me, it was like settlements are pointless in this game, and it was like, how do we make them meaningful to the whole story? So then when we got to the idea of like, all right, you're going to fight the factions, I think you brought up the fact that it's always weird that like when you defeat the boogeyman, all of his troops just walk away, right? Like that's not very, like what about all the people? What are all the people that didn't get the orders, or the people who survived the fight? Did they just give up? Like what are we going to do with them? And then the remnant faction idea was like, well, what if you had an option to make peace with them? Like somebody is going to step into that power vacuum and round up all those remnants and try and rebuild with them, or get revenge, or leave town or whatever. So yeah, I think you're right. I think all the remnants, all that stuff, even though we added it late, was actually really old writing that we were able to repurpose.
Yeah, I think so, because the underwater base for the Institute, sorry, running things for chapter 3.
Yeah, if you haven't played through it, spoiler alert.
But the remnants for the Institute are in like a Bioshock type underwater lab, and there, I think it's still there. There's like a big room that doesn't really serve a purpose, and that was going to be where the Mega Synth came out of. It's like a big hangar bay that it would sort of elevate into the ocean floor and then walk away. So I think we kept it, just like, we can't get rid of that. Like,
oh, it looks beautiful though. BB did a great job with that cell.
It doesn't serve a purpose anymore, but it's cool and it's a memory. So yeah, it's from a really old build of the story, really, where things kind of ended at chapter 2, and that would have been the end. It's like, we're done, no more.
Yeah,
nope, we have a whole other chapter.
That's what I was getting at, and then of course I'm long-winded, so I got sidetracked down a path. But the chapter 2, we wrote it knowing that we might not be able to get further than that. So like the way chapter 2 ends with the scene of them, like I remember I pushed for that multiple times, where I was like, no, there's got to be like a finale scene, like where all the important people are there, because it was just like, this might be it. Like I didn't know if we were going to be able to complete the full thing, just because it's really hard to do this stuff. So that is another benefit, I think, of the chapters, is you have this big epic story in mind. There's no guarantees that all the people are going to stick around to finish it, because this is a hobby. It is, you know, any of the big teams like that are going on mods. Like you would talk to the folks running the Skyblivion team, and I'm sure there's been plenty of times where they're like, this just isn't going to happen, and then you get like you get fortunate with the people who push and take it to the end, like Rebelsies, who are just troopers and just carry that torch onward. But it doesn't always go down that way. There's so many failed projects, and I think the nice thing about the chapters is you get to do a chunk, and you can leave it in a space where it's like, all right, well, obviously it would be more satisfying if you get resolution, but if it doesn't, at least you got it out there, and it feels like we made it to something. So like if we had ended on chapter 2 where there's this implication like there's more war coming, and we just had to leave it at that, it's still a very satisfying story. You felt like you got to go to a final battle. It was almost like the ending of most modern movies, right, where they got to leave it open to a sequel. That's kind of how we left chapter 2 versus chapter 1. The way we left that, we were like, well, we have to do. We can't end that. Like that can't just be the end there. Your best buddy gets kidnapped and then you're on your own. Like we knew that chapter 2 was going to have to end, but chapter 2 to chapter 3, it was a question mark. I didn't know if we were going to be able to pull it off or not, because it was ambitious, and even chapter 2's dev alone it was the longest dev until we got to chapter 3 that we'd ever done, because before that we were releasing stuff, I don't know, I think it was like SS1 came out, Industrial Revolution came out like 3 months later, ROTC came out maybe 4 months after that. Like we were like rapid fire pushing out stuff. So then for chapter 1, I mean, since the dev technically took place right at like alongside Industrial Revolution and ROTC, I mean, the dev cycle on that was basically 3 years just for chapter 1. So then the idea of doing that twice more, it was like almost unpalatable to me. Of like, I can't spend 10 years on this one project. I mean, lo and behold, we did and still are, but the idea of it at the time was like, it's just, I don't know that's going to happen. So that's another little plus in the column of doing it in phased releases, is we were able to like at least get something out, right? Even if it wasn't the full story, and set it up in a way that, and I think that it made for interesting pivot points, right? Like the intro to chapter 3 was really tough to write. I think there was a lot of going back on that. We had this weird, again, we inherited this kind of meta headspace from the player base who are like, okay, we've been kind of building up our HQ for over a year now, and like, how are we going to kick off the next chapter? And it changed our path too, right? Like we had a very different plan for, like, I think the horror dungeon was always the plan, right? And then it was just the end reveal of what the creature was had to change dramatically because of the chapters.
Yeah, I think that was always planned to be like that quest was planned somewhere from the end of chapter 2, because I remember writing that on a laptop, like just somewhere in the world when we just wrapped up, but it was time to continue writing, so I was just typing away. But the purpose of the quest changed because now it was your reintroduction into SS2 after being away for a while. So we couldn't have the original ending because it was just too wacky to then go into, remember that war that was going on? Yeah, let's remind you about that. So we had to change it from originally being a ghoulified alien to just being a regular ghoul that we can hopefully get a new model in for, which we didn't, but maybe one day. Because
for the ghoul, yeah. I think it was like a lack of resources.
Underwhelming for all the setup,
right.
Because the setup was meant to be for an alien. You're like, it's an alien. And I definitely have seen people react to it. It's like, it's just a ghoul. I thought it was gonna be something else.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of was going to be something else. So it's funny that people can tell that, like, that doesn't match.
Right, but even if it was, I still feel like we were kind of stuck with it had to be something underwhelming, right? Because you don't want people to think like, this is a crazy direction they're taking the story, where it was like, because it was more about setting up Aiden as like feeling overburdened, right, and a little bit shaken, so that it was there was kind of an arc of him learning to trust the team instead of being the lone wolf.
I think it was also a case of we needed to get the player back to the HQ without just throwing them into a meeting first. So it's like, what do you have them do?
Yeah.
So it was a quest we already had, but I think we sort of moved where it happened.
Right.
So
I think it was in its own cell. This was just going to be just an interesting distraction, right? It was just like, we'll send them off to this location, and then there's going to be the reveal will be at the end of it. It was almost like just like a dungeon encounter, like a side quest type encounter originally, and then it was like, we need to introduce another space in HQ to pull off some of the stuff that we dreamed up mechanics wise. To do like the hangar stuff, it was like, how do we introduce the hangar? Yeah, it's all fuzzy because the writing period. I mean, and again, I don't know if this is strength or weakness column for the chapter breakup, but there's definitely a lot of. I mean, how many notes do you have? How many spreadsheets do you have assembled for SS2 development over the years? Like,
I have all the spreadsheets. Again, I'm going to make myself seem like the best hire you've ever made. I didn't do spreadsheets. I didn't know how to do any of that planning stuff when I started. Now they're my favorite thing. I love spreadsheets. They're so good for tracking information, and as you're coming up for notes for things and deciding, this faction has all these details, and here's all the members, and here's all their equipment. And that allows me now to make sure that not everyone has to say, like, spreadsheets are great. If you're designing stories and you just want something for planning, you don't need to get those crazy expensive world building tools. I'm sure some of them are great, but just use a spreadsheet. They're fantastic. So we have so many spreadsheets for SS2.
When we eventually say we're done, like when we're like, all right, that's the last piece of content, we should release your like master spreadsheet to the world just to let them look at it, because it's pretty intense. There's a lot in there. It's a mix of like gameplay stuff and character relationships to each other and storylines, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in there that never happened that people would find very interesting to see. Like, it's a shame they didn't do that or that.
I definitely have to check and make sure there's nothing there that shouldn't be.
Oh yeah, this is not something we're gonna do tomorrow. We still have a fair amount of stuff that we left hanging, right? Like I think.
I'm seeing more like we tend to try and be quite PG to a degree, because I think that is a good way to be. And you don't want to see what I'm writing when I'm just annoyed, and there's probably all sorts of swear words
colorful
and just
language,
me ranting off on something, and just. Yeah, they're good notes for me, but I wouldn't say they're useful for anyone else without a bit of cleanup and maybe a bit of polish here and there.
The scrubbed version of the notes.
Yeah.
I think I think what we try to go with is just fit the tone of the base game, right? Like I don't think any of us has any opposition to we're not prudes, but we don't want our stuff to like stand out to be totally different than the base game, right? Like we go. I mean, like we've made exceptions, like certain factions are, you introduce a raider character, they're going to be way more vulgar. But in general, you want to keep the tone to match the game so that it doesn't feel out of place. I think that's where we use that for our design guideline, right? It's like whenever we do levels and buildings and even plot designs, it all has to fit within the base game aesthetic, even though it's like, well, why would they build this building with trash in it? It's like, because it just feels natural when you set it alongside the rest of the game. And I think that goes into our writing too.
Absolutely. I think that's it's not just writing, like you say, it's everything. You need to make sure the tone matches, and even in terms of, does it make sense to put a coat here? No, that makes no sense. You can't do that. Like, we tend to be quite anal about that kind of stuff, but I think that's one of our strengths. It means we tend to spend more time on certain things than perhaps we should, and I think we sometimes get a bit too focused on things where, like, that it really doesn't matter. Like, players aren't going to care that we went to this amount of effort for something that just, it matters to us immensely, but to a player, they're not going to notice, they're not going to care. They'd rather we spend our time elsewhere.
And I think I don't think we were consistent across the board with it either, because it was like, the project very much started out as like, I kept calling it an anthology, where it was like, when we started out with all the settlers, for example, that project was totally disconnected from what you ended up writing. It was just like, no, it would be cool if, as you build things up, you attract settlers that like that thing, right? Like, oh, you built up a bunch of industrial. Here comes a guy who's like, hey, I got an idea for a new machine, stuff like that. And those were written by a whole bunch of different people. I think we probably 12 or 13 credited writers on the various stuff. And so, everybody had cares about different things. Some people wanted more player choice. Some people wanted, a lot of very talky characters. Some people wanted people who talked very poetically. So we have a very mixed bag of styles within the mod itself. But I think in the main story, it definitely got held up to a very, as you said, anal standard for a lot of the main quest stuff. And that's why one of the biggest things I think I learned from the development of SS2, and I think we've carried it forward now into KGC, is the importance of having an editor to just have eyes on everything. Just like somebody needs to be a filtering mechanism for everything that goes in, so that we have some consistency. We watch for repetition between writers who maybe aren't communicating all the time. And that's been a big boon, I think. I don't know. What do you think? Or would you prefer, you just got to go wild and ship whatever you want?
Oh, no. Every writer needs an editor. If you don't think you need an editor, I'm sorry, you're a bad writer. And you might be a great writer, but like, without an editor, you're never going to like reach that. Something we should have done, which I think we almost say on most of our projects, is we need like a design doc, in terms of, we've gotten better at it in recent years.
Yeah.
But I think it would have been really useful just to hand any like writer just like, here's the guidelines, here's what we do, here's what we don't do. I think we tended to give very like basic instructions, but we never really made an official document of like, these are the rules when you write dialogue for a Bethesda game. I think this came up in your playthrough recently when you speak to Edmund at his church, where we follow the base game rule of, you never have the player say anything that the player character, that is, that the player didn't select the dialogue option for, because it just feels bad. And it's also not how the base game does it.
They don't do it most of the time. There are a couple of times they do it. Yeah.
Yeah, we break that rule in the main quest once or twice, but I think it's usually for comedic effect, or because there's just no way to stitch the player lines together, so we need to have this gap in between it.
Yeah.
It's something like that, where it's not necessarily bad by itself, but it just doesn't match the base game and therefore stands out, and that's not good. We try to avoid that if we can.
So I think the reason I wanted to talk to you about this, and I want to bring it back just to full circle as we close out the conversation. What was your, like, looking back on the chapters versus how we do stuff now? You think about like how we do stuff at KGC, where things are kind of a little more, one and done. We kind of go through from conception to completion in one run. Where does the chapter style releasing and writing, how does that rank? Like, what are your pros and cons for it? And would you encourage others to do the same, or would you discourage them? Do you wish we could go back to it? What were your thoughts on it overall? Like, ending thoughts on the chapter method of writing out a story?
For a big project and a large team, I think it works overall. There's positives, there's negatives, um, but the positives do outweigh the negatives. At least for the most of the team. For the writers, you're gonna have a harder time about it because it means you definitely need to have a much more solid plan. Which I think, if anyone was paying attention in chapter one, we didn't have that much of a solid plan. It took a lot of changing things and new drafts and just trying to get stuff working. By the time we got to chapter two, we kind of hit our groove, and I think it was much smoother sailing, at least in terms of getting a story that felt coherent, and we weren't sort of guessing and moving around a lot. So, in terms of everything else, chapters are amazing. In terms of writing, it is good, it is useful, because it's kind of like you're writing. It's not necessarily you're writing a chapter, you're writing sort of the first book for chapter one, and then the second book for chapter two, and the last book for chapter three. So you're making a trilogy. So it makes sense to kind of bookend things and have things be their own mini story, but there has to be an overarching story for them all. And that means you have to plan it from the beginning. And you can get away with maybe making a few things up and just leaving a few story hooks in the earlier chapters that you'll resolve later and figure out what those were for. But generally speaking, you need to have a plan. So the chapter things, it works, and I'd say probably for a team, it is the way to go, especially on a project like SS2. But do more planning than we probably did.
And we did a lot of planning. Yeah.
We did a lot of planning, but we didn't do some of the planning we needed. But that's always the way. I think at the end of a project, you can look back and realize, oh, I wish I'd done this. I wish I'd done that.
Yeah.
But you do learn a lot by not doing things right. So I don't know. Maybe you want to mess up.
Well, and I think we always say this, and we've been saying it more and more as we've been doing projects from beginning to end with KGC, is like some of the best ideas come up toward the end, like after you start putting things together. And I think this is the benefit where I will push for chapters, is one of the benefits is you're putting things together more quickly. Like if we are writing and pre-producing everything up till the end, you're not actually seeing it in action sparks a lot of ideas and can alter the course of the writing in a positive way, where it's like, oh, now that we see how this works and this works, those would tie together, and you get new moments that appear that you may not have thought of in a bubble where you're just writing kind of in your head without it. Like sometimes stuff comes together in the crafting of everything that can help guide things in new directions, and I think there's some magic there.
So we're gonna say chapters good. You should do chapters. They're pretty okay.
I'm very pro chapter. Yeah, very pro chapter. So I would encourage, especially because I think a lot of the big mod projects tend to start out as like one person's baby, right? Somebody's just like, they start making a big world space, or they start writing this big tale, and when it's one person, you can plan for, until the cows come home, just go crazy with the planning. So then you could plan it out in chapters, and then it becomes a little more reasonable to assemble a team to make one of those chapters happen. And then hopefully that sparks a wave of support and more people who want to jump on the cause with you and gives you inspiration. There's just, yeah, I cannot sing praises of doing things in chapters enough. So thank you for suffering through the difficulties that it brought to the writing table. I think SS2 doesn't exist without chapters is my also takeaway. And I think a lot more big mods could exist if they embraced the chapter release schedule.
As long as they plan it out, yes.
So get planning, folks. If you want to put out a big epic story, do a lot of planning. But like Sirick said, I think imagine it like a series of books. That was definitely the case for when we decided to go the chapter route. We definitely started shifting the story. Like, all right, where's a good point to where this ends, right? So so that the chapters can feel complete in themselves. So I think that is a good way to look at them. Is think of it like you're writing a little mini trilogy of games that are going to flow one into the other. So
yeah,
I hope to see more ambitious projects make it to completion, because it's a sad day whenever you see the announcements of some of these folding. An exciting but mixed feeling day when they get announced, because I'm like, oh, is that one going to make it? And so I hope we've inspired some of you to try this, because I'd love to see more of these come out. So thank you for Sirick for joining me, and as always, being a key member on the team over here so that we can keep putting out cool stuff.
You are very welcome.
Alrighty, thank you everybody for joining us for that discussion. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And now we're going to continue the C3 raid train. We're going to head on over and check out a presentation on Fallout Chicago, a city I absolutely love. Can't wait to see if they are able to pull it off. Let's go check it out.